Medieval Health Diseases, Plague 1. Introduction. Imagine waking up in the 14th century to find your entire town dying from a mysterious fever. No doctors could explain it, no prayers could stop it, just corpses piling up in the streets. This was the reality of the Black Death, a plague so devastating it wiped out half of Europe. But what if I told you medieval people weren't just helpless victims? They pioneered quarantine, built isolation hospitals, and even tracked disease spread, laying the foundation for modern public health. How did they fight back against an invisible killer with no understanding of germs? The myth of helpless superstition. The common image of medieval people during plague outbreaks shows them praying helplessly while death surrounded them. But this overlooks their surprisingly organized efforts to stop disease. Contrary to popular belief, many towns took concrete actions that went far beyond religious rituals. In Venice, city officials didn't just wait for divine intervention. They built the first permanent plague hospital in 1423 on a secluded island. Ships arriving from infected ports had to wait offshore before docking. Records show that by the late 1300s, multiple cities were enforcing isolation periods for the sick. Florence even appointed health officers to inspect incoming merchants and goods. The flagellants, who traveled in groups whipping themselves to atone for sins, represent one extreme reaction that often dominates historical accounts. Yet these processions were banned quickly in many regions because officials recognized they actually spread disease further. Far more common were quiet bureaucratic measures, burial regulations, travel restrictions, and designated caregivers. What emerges from municipal archives isn't a picture of blind superstition, but of pragmatic adaptation. Milan's detailed health ordinances show fines for hiding sick family members, while Pistoia's laws prohibited contaminated bedding from being sold. These weren't random acts of desperation. They were calculated policies based on observation. The balance between spiritual and medical approaches reflects how medieval minds understood illness. Prayer and pilgrimages coexisted with practical steps because people saw disease as having both physical and moral causes. By studying their responses, we see the beginnings of organized public health systems evolving in real time. This raises another question. How did they determine which measures worked? The answer lies in their gradual standardization of quarantine, a process filled with trial and error. Third quarantine. From guesswork to policy. When the first plague ships arrived in Mediterranean ports in the 1340s, officials scrambled to contain the unseen threat. Their initial solution was simple: force incoming ships to wait offshore before allowing anyone to disembark. The Republic of Ragusa mandated the first recorded 30-day isolation period in 1377. But this early quarantine system had flaws. The standard 14-day waiting period seemed reasonable at first, until officials noticed sick travelers developing symptoms after being cleared. Reports from Venice show some people fell ill nearly a month after exposure, forcing authorities to extend quarantines. By 1383, Ragusa had doubled the period to 40 days, known as the quarantinaria, the linguistic root of our word quarantine. This wasn't arbitrary. Mediterranean trading cities kept detailed logs noting how long it took for symptoms to appear after suspected exposure. The 40-day window emerged from these observations, long enough to cover most cases while minimizing disruption to commerce. Marseille tried shorter durations but saw outbreaks resurge repeatedly before reluctantly adopting the 40-day standard. Some cities went beyond maritime quarantines. Milan implemented strict cordons around infected households, marking doors with crosses and stationing guards. Florence required all incoming travelers to present health certificates proving they came from plague-free regions. Violators faced steep fines or imprisonment. Early evidence of enforcement mechanisms. The patchwork of local measures gradually coalesced into broader policies. Venice established a permanent health magistracy in 1486 to coordinate regional quarantine efforts, one of the first centralized public health authorities. By the early 1500s, standardized quarantine procedures appeared in printed manuals distributed among Italian city-states. What began as desperate improvisation evolved into systematic defense. Officials tracked outbreaks through merchant correspondence, adjusted restrictions based on seasonality, and even developed early contact tracing methods. Their trial-and-error approach produced surprisingly effective protocols, considering they lacked germ theory. Protocols that would eventually cross the Alps and reshape European medical practice. But while maritime cities refined quarantine measures, another disease had long forced medieval societies to develop different containment strategies. Leprosy, with its slow progression rather than sudden epidemics, presented an entirely separate challenge that predated plague responses by centuries. 4. Leprosy, the first public health crisis. Centuries before the plague ships arrived, medieval Europe faced a different medical nightmare: leprosy. Unlike the swift devastation of the Black Death, this disease worked slowly, gradually disfiguring its victims over years. By the 12th century, communities had to grapple with how to handle sufferers who remained alive but ostracized for decades. Leprosaria, specialized hospitals for lepers, began appearing across Europe as early as the 1100s. England alone had over 300 by 1250, situated along major roads where beggars congregated. These weren't just dumping grounds for the unwanted. Records from St. Giles in London show lepers received food, shelter, and spiritual care. Some institutions even allowed married couples to stay together if both contracted the disease. Yet the system balanced compassion with strict control. Laws required lepers to wear distinctive clothing, typically a gray or black cloak, with a bell or clapper to announce their presence. They were barred from entering taverns, sharing drinking vessels, or touching market goods. In France, legal statutes declared that once someone was diagnosed by a jury of townspeople and clergy, they underwent a symbolic funeral ritual before entering the leper colony. The disease's misunderstood nature created contradictions. Medical texts described it as both contagious and hereditary, leading to bizarre precautions like banning lepers from having children. Some cities permitted them to beg within designated areas, while others drove them completely outside town walls. What unified these responses was the medieval preference for ordered systems, a framework later adapted for plague management. Church records reveal surprising details about daily life in leprosaria. At Canterbury's St. Nicholas Hospital, inmates could keep small gardens and receive weekly allowances of bread and ale. Many establishments functioned as self-sufficient communities, with chapels, bakehouses, and even governing councils of senior residents. This semi-autonomy suggests authorities recognize the dignity of sufferers while maintaining public safety. Contrary to popular belief, not all diagnoses were accurate. Paleopathological studies of excavated remains show only about half of those buried in leper cemeteries actually had Hansen's disease. Many likely suffered from psoriasis, syphilis, or other skin conditions misidentified as leprosy, meaning segregation policies sometimes isolated people unnecessarily for life. The experience with leprosy proved crucial when deadlier epidemics arrived. Concepts like isolating contagious individuals, maintaining health registers, and creating specialized institutions didn't emerge spontaneously during the Black Death. They built upon centuries of trial with chronic illnesses. Venice's later plague islands owed their existence to earlier leper colonies, just as quarantine procedures mirrored the controlled mobility imposed on lepers. England's gradual shift illustrates how perceptions changed. As plague overtook leprosy as the primary health threat in the 14th century, many leprosaria were repurposed. London's St. James Hospital became an almshouse, while others turned to general care. This transition reveals how medieval communities adapted health infrastructures to new crises, applying lessons from one disease to combat another. By the time the plague arrived, Europe already had generations of experience managing long-term health emergencies. The bureaucratic systems that tracked leprosy cases formed the backbone of later plague containment efforts. Town councils knew how to enforce isolation, medical inspectors understood disease surveillance, and populations were accustomed to public health restrictions, all factors that would shape responses when an even deadlier enemy appeared. The Black Death of 1347 didn't hit a disorganized medieval world. It struck societies that had been refining disease control measures for over 200 years through their handling of leprosy. When the plague began crossing borders, city leaders didn't start from scratch. They modified existing frameworks, proving that medieval medicine was far more systematic than we often assume. Yet nothing could have prepared them for how quickly this new threat would travel or how devastating its path would become. 5. The Black Death's arrival timeline. The Black Death didn't sweep through Europe in a single wave. It followed the paths of medieval commerce, creeping from port to port along well-established trade routes. Its progression reveals weaknesses in the surprisingly interconnected medieval world. When Genoese trading ships docked in Messina, Sicily, in October 1347, locals noticed something horrifying. Most of the crew was dead or dying, their bodies covered in dark swellings. The frightened Sicilians expelled the ships, but it was too late. Within weeks, the disease had taken root in the city. Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani recorded how rumors of plague preceded its arrival farther north. His writings note how merchants carried news of mass deaths in Constantinople long before symptoms appeared in Italy. When the disease reached Florence in April 1348, it killed with such speed that burials became impossible. Corpses piled up in vacant lots. By June, Venice was losing 500 people daily. The relentless spread followed predictable routes, down the Rhone Valley to Avignon, then across shipping lanes to Marseille and Barcelona. Yet not all areas suffered equally. Isolated alpine villages and parts of Poland saw few cases, protected by geography and limited trade. Regions directly linked to Mediterranean commerce suffered worst. Major trading hubs like Bruges and London recorded mortality rates above 50%. The pattern was clear. Where goods traveled, the plague followed. Grain shipments from the Black Sea and Egyptian cotton cargoes unknowingly carried infected fleas in their holds and bales. Officials in some cities reacted swiftly. Milan's ruler sealed infected houses with residents inside, delaying outbreaks for months. But others hesitated. When Parisian doctors advised closing city gates in 1348, Authorities refused, fearing economic collapse. The results were stark. Milan's death rate stayed below 15%, while Paris lost half its population. The plague timeline exposes medieval globalization's double-edged sword. Expanding trade networks meant Sicilian wheat fed Florentine merchants, Flemish wool clothed English nobles, and Asian spices flavored French feasts. But those same connections became highways for disaster. Ships that once delivered silk and silver now transported death. Surviving customs records show dramatic drops in trade volume after outbreaks. Venice's textile imports plummeted by 80% between 1348 and 1350 as ports shut down. Some responses reveal striking awareness of contagion even without understanding microbes. Padua banned all outsiders during outbreaks, while Nuremberg burned victims' possessions. Others resorted to desperation. In Strasbourg, citizens blamed Jews for supposedly poisoning wells, leading to mass executions despite clergy objections. Such violence often followed outbreaks, revealing how quickly civic order collapsed under strain. The plague's movement through Europe wasn't random. It mapped perfectly onto medieval infrastructure. Roman roads turned into transmission routes, pilgrimage sites became superspreader events, and market schedules dictated outbreak timelines. Towns hosting annual fairs often saw sudden surges weeks later. A French chronicle describes how the plague arrived in Besançon precisely during Pentecost celebrations when crowds gathered. Remote settlements sometimes avoided infection through extraordinary measures. The village of Ayam in England isolated completely during a 1665 outbreak, sacrificing itself to protect neighboring communities, a drastic echo of medieval quarantine principles. Iceland remained plague-free until 1402, thanks to treacherous North Atlantic shipping conditions. The uneven spread had lasting demographic effects. Areas spared initial waves often suffered later resurgences. The 1361 Second Pestilence ravaged previously untouched regions. Milan eventually succumbed in 1363 after decades of relative safety. These delayed outbreaks suggest medieval people weren't facing one catastrophe, but repeated assaults over generations. Trade's role became undeniable as patterns repeated. When the plague reached Norway in 1349, it came via a wool ship from England. Norwegian annals describe how the vessel drifted ashore with no survivors. Russian cities first experienced outbreaks after Tatar merchants bypassed quarantine. Each recurrence reinforced the connection between commerce and contagion. Yet paradoxically, the devastation sometimes accelerated economic innovation. Labor shortages from mass deaths forced wage increases for surviving workers. English agricultural pay doubled post-plague. Some historians argue these shifts began dismantling feudal structures faster than any rebellion could. The disease reshaping medieval society also accidentally modernized it. The timeline's most haunting aspect is its predictability once established. 6. Bizarre cures. That actually worked medieval medicine often gets dismissed as pure superstition, but some treatments worked despite flawed theories. While bloodletting and mercury ointments did more harm than good, other remedies contained active compounds we still use today. Willow bark, widely prescribed for pain, contained salicylic acid, the foundation of modern aspirin. Medical texts also recommended honey for wounds, which we now know has antibacterial properties. Herbalists used digitalis from foxglove plants to treat heart conditions, foreshadowing contemporary cardiac medications. Surgeons boiled wine to clean instruments, unknowingly utilizing alcohol's antiseptic qualities. These accidental breakthroughs show medieval medicine wasn't entirely misguided, just operating without crucial scientific frameworks.